Are you actually still paying money for store-bought bread yeast? Do you find yourself wanting to bake, but you don't have any yeast on hand? If so, you're watching the right video. Our ancestors actually never used store-bought yeast. The first commercial yeast cake wasn't even invented until 1825. Active dry yeast didn't come into full production until the 1940s. So how did they make bread? In this video, Sean will run you through the process of pulling wild yeast from the air using only potatoes and a little sugar, and he'll bake some of the best bread you'll ever eat in your life. So let's jump in. Please consider subscribing to our newsletter by clicking on the link in the description and comment section below. If you enjoy this video, please subscribe and click the like button to help the channel grow.
This is one of the oldest methods of pulling yeast from the air, and it has been used for centuries by our ancestors. You might not ever buy store-bought yeast again. I'll run you through the whole recipe and method, and I will give you just enough history. This process will take at least 12 hours or a full day, so you won't be able to start it and bake bread an hour later. What you get as a reward for your patience, though, is maybe some of the best bread you will ever eat in your life. It will have a better texture and a better flavor than regular bread. I'll provide you with that recipe at the end of this video. You'll need a potato peeler, small saucepan with lid, 1.5 cups water, 1 teaspoon sugar, 1 tablespoon flour, and a mason jar or similar jar with a lid. Begin by peeling the potato, making sure to remove all the skin. I usually give it a quick rinse as well to remove any dirt or dust. The cleaner it is, the better. Cube the potato, just like you might for a potato salad, in about 1-inch rough pieces. Place them in a saucepan with water and boil. If your water is heavily chlorinated, you may want to purchase some spring water for this process. So much fermentation comes from the quality of your initial water, and yeast hates chlorine. Place them on the stove and let them boil for about 10 minutes. You want them to be easily mashable with just a fork and a little pressure. Remove from the heat and mash in the water until you have no large chunks. It should resemble mashed potatoes in milky water when you're done. Here my water boiled off. That's not a problem. I just add some more water and bring it to a boil again. Stir in the teaspoon of sugar while hot and gently place the saucepan lid on top and set aside. You'll need it to come completely to room temperature for the next step. Once it is cooled to room temperature in your saucepan or very near to room temperature, give it a swirl and pour it into your mason jar. Let it cool completely to room temperature with a loose lid on the jar. What you've created at this point is a semi-pasteurized slurry of starch and sugar that yeast love. This is often referred to as a liquid broth. You want to keep it covered and sealed at this point because both yeast and bacteria will love to move in and start eating up all those sugars and breaking down the starches further. We want to let the yeast have first dibs at the slurry, so we're letting it come down to room temperature to create the most inviting environment. Yeast works by eating the sugars and expelling CO2 and alcohol. The trace amounts of alcohol cook away, but the CO2 is trapped in the dough, imparting tiny air bubbles and providing the grain and light texture to the bread. This same yeast could be used to ferment beverages, and the potato method is used by old world vodka distillers, and some even today. For making bread yeast, we are more interested in the CO2 part of the yeast feast. The bubbling created by the yeast eating the sugars and enzymatically breaking down the edges of starch strings acts as a leavening agent and causes the bread to rise. Without it, you'll have a dense and hard cracker. The addition of a potato in a standard bread recipe provides more nutrients for the yeast to stay healthy. This will result in fluffy bread with excellent light grain quality. Store-bought yeast is a couple of different strains that have been isolated because of the particular way they work with dough. Yeast does impart flavor as well, so bread dough yeast provides very narrow and specific flavor range. Yeast is a fungus, but don't think of it as a mushroom. They're on the surface of any fruit you pick, from apples to grapes to berries. All we are doing with this method is attracting the yeast that loves to eat sugar. So let's return to the wild yeast we are cultivating from the air with the potato. Once it has reached room temperature in the mason jar, you should see significant separation. The potato is at the bottom and the milky water is on the top. You will get a slight boiled potato smell from it. If it has a sourdough smell to it, that's okay. It just means that the lactic acid bacteria are in your mix as well. This is what gives sourdough its flavor. Your finished bread will have a sourdough flavor as a result. At this point, Set the jar with the lid off next to an open window or outside in a shaded area with a light breeze for 10 minutes. Repeat this open air exposure 2 or 3 times over 6 hours. Replace the lid loosely each time and return it to your cool spot in the kitchen. After 12 hours or a full day, you should see bubbling at the top of your liquid. It should have a bready, yeasty, or sourdough smell starting to develop. It's okay if you can't detect that scent yet. If you don't have either the bubbling or the bready smell developing, repeat the open air process for another 10 minutes. If you have any colored mold of any kind, throw it out and start over. Some say to just clear this off and let the yeast growth continue, but I don't trust molds, so it's best to start over. The yeast, however, tends to be faster to grow than mold. Once you see bubbling occurring around the surface of the liquid, add the tablespoon of flour. Don't use any metal utensils at this point so as not to inhibit or dull yeast growth. I just place the tablespoon of yeast on top, tighten the lid, and shake it until mixed. Each time you place the potato starter in your quiet, cool place in your kitchen, make sure that the cap is loose and the CO2 gases can escape. The addition of the flour encourages yeast growth specific to the consumption of the sugars derived from the starches in the flour. You're creating an environment that is best suited to Saccharomyces cerevisiae, yeast. Technically, you could use the potato starter as soon as you see the bubbling, but you will have better results if you let the yeast grow and reproduce. It will work faster when you inoculate your dough with millions or billions of yeast than it will if you do it with 100,000 yeast cells. When you have significant bubbling occurring, or you see globules floating to the surface on the CO2 and dropping back down when the gases are released on the surface, you're ready to bake bread. This is what I wait for. Congratulations. You've successfully pulled yeast out of the air and created a colony of millions of single-cell organisms. If you aren't ready to bake bread, you can treat this as a starter and add another tablespoon of flour. It will keep on your counter for about a day with no problem, and a few days if you put it in your refrigerator. Because you are using wild yeast, however, you want to use it when the specific yeast we want is most active, and that's right now. If you wait too long, you run the risk of the yeast living its full life cycle and dying off, and other bacteria taking hold. That can impart off or sour flavors and result in little to no rising of your dough. Here's the best bread recipe you will ever bake. To use a potato yeast starter, you simply need to pour off the starchy water at the top and use it in place of water in any bread recipe. I like to use the whole starter though, as I think the potato lends a smooth and fluffy texture to the bread. When you do this though, you have to have a good understanding of bread dough. Make sure it isn't too sticky and not too dense. You can adjust this by adding and working in 1 tablespoon of flour if it's too sticky. Repeat with 1 tablespoon of flour until your dough isn't too sticky or too wet. This will make 2 delicious loaves, one for you and one for a friend. Add 2 tablespoons of sugar to 6.5 cups of bread flour. Add 2 teaspoons salt. Next, add 1.5 cups potato water to the dry ingredients. To this, you will add a 1/2 cup milk as well. Then add 4 tablespoons of butter. I measure this out by simply eyeballing it. A little extra butter won't hurt your mix. Mix the dough until all the ingredients are combined. Knead in the bowl until a stiff dough is formed. Remember, if it's too sticky, just add and work in flour 1 tablespoon at a time until you have a firm dough that isn't visibly wet on the surface. Conversely, if your dough is much too dry and won't come together nicely for you, just add in a tablespoon of water or milk at a time until you get a nice dough ball that feels moist but isn't sticky or dry. Knead until smooth and elastic. This will take about 5 to 8 minutes. Place in a grease bowl, cover the bowl with plastic wrap or a kitchen towel, and allow it to rise in a warm area of your kitchen, but not in direct sunlight. Your dough should double in size. When it has, turn it onto a lightly floured surface and punch it down. Pinch and shape into 2 equal loaves and place in buttered greased loaf pans. Cover and allow them to rise again until they double in size. Preheat your oven to 350 degrees. When the loaves have doubled in their pans, place in the preheated oven and bake for 35 to 40 minutes. After 35 to 40 minutes, when the tops are lovely golden brown, remove your loaves from the oven. When they are baked completely, I like to turn them onto a wire rack and brush the top with some melted butter. If you can't wait and cut them while hot, be sure to set the loaf on your cutting board with the cut side down so the moisture won't escape. Enjoy. That's all there is to it. If you know how to bake bread and pull yeast out of the air with a potato, any disaster can befall you, and you will have the basic ability to make bread. There are countless variations to both the potato yeast starter and the basic bread recipe. I would love to hear how your loaves turn out, and if you have any additions or alterations to the recipe, like using honey instead of sugar. Leave them in the comments below. Remember to give this video the thumbs up and consider subscribing to this channel for more great practical prepping recipes and skills. Keep building your skills.